You know how sometimes a small headline can open up a surprisingly big can of worms?
No, Daffy.
Well, lately I've been seeing some news about fluoride in drinking water that's really got me thinking. And it's not about adding more, well, it seems like some places are hitting pause or even going in reverse.
That's right.
So for this deep dive, which we've put together just for you, we're going to unpack exactly what's happening.
Absolutely. It's a fascinating mix, isn't it? You've got these recent policy shifts happening alongside ongoing scientific debate.
Yeah.
Today, we're zeroing in on what's happening in Utah. And Florida, they've decided to stop adding fluoride to public water. And we'll pair that with a look at some, well, pretty compelling research on fluoride exposure's effects.
Exactly. We've got a couple of recent news articles covering the bans, one from Utah, one from Florida. And then there's this quite hefty scientific review that really digs into the link between fluoride exposure and kids' IQ.
It's a lot to wade through.
It is. So our mission, should we choose to accept it, which we have, is to basically guide you through all this, pull out the really key stuff you need to know, but, without making it feel like homework.
Think of us as your navigators on this, your informed companions, maybe.
I like that. Companions. So, where should we start? The news landscape.
Sounds good. Let's set the scene.
Right. So, Utah, there's a new law, and it means they've officially stopped adding fluoride to public drinking water.
And hot on their heels, Florida, making it the second U.S. state to implement a ban like this.
Which is pretty significant when you think about why fluoride was added in the first place, right? The whole idea was strengthening tooth enamel, preventing decay.
Exactly. A major public dental health strategy for, what, decades now?
Yeah, decades.
So understandably, dentists and public health folks are voicing some real concerns about these bans.
They are.
They're worried we might see a rise in dental problems that could have been prevented, especially for young children and maybe families who don't have easy access to other fluoride sources or regular dental care.
It just makes sense, doesn't it? If it's in the water, everyone gets that baseline protection.
Right.
One article quoted a pediatric dentist, Dr. Darren Chamberlain. He said, kids in areas with fluoridated water, they just typically don't get cavities. Like 8 or 9 times out of 10, he said.
Wow. That really paints a picture of the impact, doesn't it?
It does.
It highlights that community-wide benefit. So in Utah, the response from the Utah Oral Health Coalition is this public awareness campaign. Tagline is, "My smile matters."
Catchy.
Trying to push good oral hygiene, obviously, but also talking about fluoride supplements as, an alternative now.
And it's interesting how they have to tailor the message, isn't it? Lorna Kochi from the coalition mentioned that for the half of Utah that did have fluoridation, the message is kind of like, okay, it's gone from the water, so here's what you need to do instead.
Right. Adapt.
But for the other half that never had it, it's more just general encouragement for good habits.
Makes sense. And it means public health has to shift gears, too. Brian Hatch, the health director in Davis County, pointed out they'll need to, step up their efforts to keep reinforcing those oral health messages.
More outreach needed then.
Definitely. It takes more resources when you remove a broad measure like water fluoridation.
And even in Salt Lake City, where there's some natural fluoride in the water anyway.
A little bit, yeah.
Any added fluoride is set to disappear pretty soon. They're actually monitoring it quite closely. The Department of Environmental Quality is asking for photo proof that the equipment's been disconnected.
Wow, they're serious about the switch.
Very concrete, yeah.
And, the underlying reason, or at least the justification given for these bans, often circles back to potential health concerns beyond teeth.
Right.
Both articles touched on this. The Florida piece specifically mentioned links found between fluoride exposure in pregnancy and neurobehavioral issues in kids. And it also referenced a federal review connecting higher fluoride levels with lower IQ scores in children.
Okay, so that brings us neatly to the research part.
Exactly. Let's dive into that scientific review.
All right, buckle up, because this is where it gets, well, maybe a bit dense, but really interesting. This review, they started with almost 2,000 studies.
Incredible amount.
Yeah, and they whittled that down to 33 they thought were relevant, and used 30 in their main analysis, the meta-analysis. That's some serious sifting.
It really is. And the headline finding, they calculate a summary mean difference in IQ score, comparing the highest fluoride exposure groups to the lowest.
Yeah.
Across all the studies, they found an average IQ score decrease of -4.68 points.
-4.68 8. Okay. And did they break it down by source, like water versus other things?
They did. When looking specifically at drinking water fluoride, the average decrease was even slightly larger, minus 5.60 IQ points.
Wow.
And for urinary fluoride levels, which is often used as a marker of total exposure, the decrease was minus a 3.84.
Those numbers definitely grab your attention. Did they look at like a dose response thing? Does more fluoride mean a bigger drop?
Good question. Yes, they did a dose-response analysis for drinking water fluoride. They found what they described as a substantially linear decrease in IQ as water fluoride went up, particularly above 1 milligram per liter, or mgl.
Okay.
Up to 2 milligl, they estimated about a 3.05 IQ point decrease for every 1 milligl increase in fluoride.
3 points per milligram per liter.
And interestingly, the trend seemed to get even steeper above that 2 milligl mark.
Hmm.
They also found an association with urinary fluoride above 0.28 milligl, which they reckon corresponds to roughly 0.7 milligl in drinking water, but it was a weaker link.
So the pattern seems to be there in the overall data. More fluoride, lower IQ. Sounds worrying. But hang on, I remember reading something important about the quality of these studies in the review.
Yes, this is absolutely crucial, a major caveat. The researchers themselves pointed out that the strongest link, the inverse association between fluoride and IQ, was predominantly found in the studies they assessed as having a high risk of bias.
High risk of bias. Okay, that's key.
In fact, the only study they judged to have a low risk of bias, it found no significant adverse effect on IQ.
Right. So that really changes the picture, doesn't it? Most studies suggest a problem, but the highest quality one doesn't.
Exactly. It throws a lot of uncertainty into the mix. The review authors were very careful to state that residual confounding couldn't be ruled out in many studies.
Confounding? Like other factors that weren't accounted for.
Precisely. Things like socioeconomic status, parental education, nutrition, exposure to other environmental factors, things that can also affect a child's IQ independently of fluoride. If a study didn't properly adjust for those, you can't be sure if it's the fluoride or those other factors causing the observed difference.
I see. So the link might not be causal, or at least not as strong as it looks in some studies.
That's the concern. They stressed the need for more high-quality prospective studies following people over time to get a clearer picture. Though they did also mention that even the studies they had to exclude from the main analysis, often because the exposure levels weren't clear, also tended to report lower IQ with higher fluoride. So the signal's there across many studies, but the quality issue looms large.
How did the studies break down in terms of that risk assessment? How many were high, moderate, low?
Okay, so out of the ones they looked at closely,
Yeah.
11 were rated high risk of bias, 19 moderate risk, and only 3 low risk.
Only 3 low risk. Wow.
Yeah. And the primary reason for being rated high risk, usually that lack of adjustment for potential confounders we just talked about. Another big factor was how participants were selected. Often studies specifically chose groups based on known high or low fluoride exposure, which can introduce bias right from the start.
That makes sense. If you compare a group living near a polluting factory with high fluoride to a group in a pristine area, there might be lots of other differences between those groups besides just the fluoride, right?
Exactly. It muddies the waters, scientifically speaking.
So were there any studies that did things differently, maybe ones that didn't select based on exposure?
Yes, and the review highlights this. There are cohort studies where they follow groups over time, often from birth, without selecting them based on fluoride exposure initially. And these studies tend to do a better job adjusting for those confounding variables.
And what did those studies find?
Generally, studies like those by Broadbent, Farmas, and Till found only a very mild association between fluoride and IQ, or sometimes no statistically significant link at all. And when the review authors did a subgroup analysis looking only at these better quality longitudinal studies, the association was much, much weaker than in the cross-sectional ones.
Okay, so that's a consistent pattern. The better the study design, the weaker the link seems to be.
That really seems to be the critical message coming out of this review regarding the IQ question. It strongly suggests that methodological limitations in many of the earlier or less robust studies might be exaggerating the effect, or even creating a spurious one. The lack of control for things like socioeconomic status is a really big potential issue.
This is way more nuanced than just fluoride lowers IQ. The evidence seems really debated, especially when you look closely at how the research was done.
Absolutely. It's complex. The review also mentioned estimates of typical fluoride intake. The European Commission, for example, estimated intake from water and drinks, And the review pointed out that a young child could potentially exceed the recommended adequate daily intake, or ADI, when you add up all sources: water, food, toothpaste.
Right, because the ADI is mainly set to prevent cavities while minimizing fluorosis, those white spots on teeth.
Exactly. But this meta-analysis raises the question of whether there could be IQ impacts even around those ADI levels, though, again, we have that crucial finding from the single low-risk of bias study showing no effect.
It's like walking a tightrope trying to get the dental benefits without crossing into potential other risks.
A very good analogy. And the review does briefly touch on how fluoride might potentially affect the brain. It mentions accumulation in brain areas important for memory and learning, potential effects via oxidative stress,
Plausible mechanisms, then.
plausible biological pathways, yes.
Yeah.
They also note the blood-brain barrier isn't fully developed in young kids, making them potentially more vulnerable. And there's also a separate line of research linking fluoride to thyroid issues like hypothyroidism, which itself can negatively impact early brain development.
So the biological possibility is there, but the big question mark remains over whether typical exposure levels actually cause significant harm and the strength of the evidence linking them.
Precisely. And this specific review added that dose-response analysis for drinking water, which was a contribution. But its most important conclusion might be the one about study quality. The fact that higher quality studies show weaker or null results really casts doubt on the stronger findings from lower quality studies. Methodological flaws seem key.
Okay, so we've got the news, Utah and Florida stopping fluoridation. We've dug into the research potential link to IQ, but heavily debated and potentially confounded by study quality. So now, the big one. What does this all mean for you, the listener? How does this affect everyday life, health decisions?
Well, it means we're in a bit of a gray area, navigating an ongoing scientific conversation. You've got the very well-established decades-long evidence for fluoride preventing tooth decay.
Yeah, that's solid.
And on the other hand, you have these emerging but still quite uncertain potential neurodevelopmental risks. It's a tricky balance for public health policy and for individuals, too.
So for listeners in Utah and Florida, the immediate practical thing is, well, the fluoride's not in the tap water anymore, soon won't be, which means being maybe extra vigilant about oral hygiene, brushing regularly, flossing, and definitely using fluoride toothpaste.
Absolutely critical. And the World Health Organization recommends toothpaste with 1,000 to 1,500 parts per million fluoride for good protection.
And supervision for young kids is key, right? Making sure they don't swallow too much, using just a tiny smear.
Yes, very important. A rice grain amount for toddlers, maybe pea size for older kids,
Yeah.
and encouraging spitting it out, because they can swallow quite a bit otherwise.
Okay. And what about other sources? Supplements.
Supplements exist, yes, drops or tablets, but that's something you really need to discuss with a dentist or doctor, especially for children. Getting the dosage right is crucial, and it depends on other fluoride exposure. It needs personalized advice.
Makes sense. And we should also remember fluoride isn't just something added to water, is it? It's naturally present in lots of places.
It is, in varying amounts in different water sources, soil, even some foods. It's part of the natural environment.
And there are other ways communities get fluoride besides water, aren't there?
Oh, yes. Fluoridated salt is quite common in some parts of Europe and Latin America, and studies show it's pretty effective, similar to water fluoridation.
Interesting.
Then there are programs using fluoridated milk, often targeting school children, also shown to reduce decay. And of course, all the topical things, not just toothpaste, but mouth rinses, gels, varnishes applied by dentists, all have evidence supporting their effectiveness.
So lots of tools in the toolbox.
Definitely. Often the best cavity prevention comes from a mix of systemic, like water or salt, and topical, like toothpaste fluoride. But of course, combining sources also increases the total intake, so careful management is needed to avoid fluorosis and potentially other issues.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. Key takeaways. We're seeing states like Utah and Florida pull back on water fluoridation, reflecting these growing questions and concerns, even though the dental benefits are really well known.
Right. And the research we looked at suggests there might be a link between higher fluoride exposure and lower IQ in kids, but, and this is a big but,
It's heavily debated.
very heavily debated, and the quality of the study seems to make a huge difference. The strongest studies show weak or no effects.
So for you listening, the message seems to be, stay informed, understand the nuances here. The science is still evolving on some of these potential risks.
And talk to the professionals, your dentist, your doctor. They can give you advice tailored to your situation, your family's needs, helping you navigate how to best maintain oral health, especially if your community's water fluoridation status changes.
Absolutely. And maybe a final thought to leave you with. As these perspectives on fluoride shift, how do you weigh those established dental benefits against these potential, still being researched risks for yourself, for your family?
And what bigger questions does this whole situation raise for you about how we evaluate and decide on public health policies in general? Lots to think about.